boy is born in the shadow of a prison wall and ends up holding the power to dismiss a nation's elected leader. That contrast isn't a metaphor. It's the fuse that will burn for decades, right up to a single signature that will detonate Australia's politics. But before the world knows him as Sir John Kerr, before the marble halls and the vice-regal uniform, there is a child in working class. Balmain, Sydney, learning early that life can close in like iron bars. John Robert Kerr enters the world on 24th September 1914 as the First World War is swallowing Europe. His family's reality is far from the speeches and flags. His father, Harry Kerr, is a boilermaker. Hard work, hard hands, hard days. His mother, Laura, holds the household together with the kind of quiet endurance that never makes headlines. Money is tight, prospects tighter. Balmain is a place of docks and smoke, of men who come home exhausted and still worry about tomorrow. And looming nearby is the brutal fact of the state. The prison at Long Bay, a reminder that authority is not an idea. It's a building, a gate, a lock. John is bright, but brightness doesn't pay school fees. He attends Fort Street High School, one of the most demanding public schools in New South Wales, and he feels the pressure of it. The sense that he is walking into rooms built for other people's sons. He is not born into comfort or connections. He is born into a world where you earn every inch, and where the wrong step can cost you years. That fear of slipping, of being trapped by circumstance, never fully leaves him. It doesn't make him timid. It makes him hungry. He studies hard and he wins scholarships. Scholarships are not just awards. For Kerr, they are escape routes. They are doors that open when you don't have the key. He goes on to the University of Sydney, and the contrast sharpens. The sandstone buildings, the old traditions, the confident voices of students who assume they will lead. Kerr does not assume, he calculates, he watches. He learns how power speaks, how it dresses, how it persuades. He is drawn to law because law is the language of the state, the language that can protect you or crush you, depending on who is holding it. In the 1930s, Australia is still bruised by the Great Depression. Jobs vanish, families fracture, and politics turns bitter. Kerr is coming of age in a country where the promise of stability feels fragile. He is not a revolutionary. He is something more dangerous in a different way. A believer in institutions, in rules, in the idea that order can be engineered. But he is also a young man who knows that rules are written by people, and people can bend them. He qualifies as a barrister. The courtroom becomes his arena, a place where words can change outcomes, where a single argument can tilt a judge's mind, where the stakes are real and immediate. He is ambitious and he is disciplined. He builds a reputation for sharpness and stamina. Yet even as he climbs, he is not simply chasing money. He is chasing legitimacy, the kind that cannot be taken away by a sneer about your background. Then the Second World War arrives, and with it a new kind of pressure. Australia is pulled into a global conflict that reaches even the quiet streets of Sydney. Kerr serves in wartime roles connected to the legal and administrative machinery of the country. The war years harden many men. For Kerr, they also clarify something. The state is not abstract. In crisis, the state becomes everything. Rationing, conscription, censorship, emergency powers. The law is no longer just a profession. It is a lever. After the war, Kerr's path bends toward public service and the architecture of governance. He becomes involved in legal reform and professional bodies, moving between the courtroom and the committees where policy is shaped. He is not the loudest voice in the room, but he is often the most prepared. He reads the documents others skim. He remembers the clauses others forget. He understands procedure the way a chess player understands the board. Not as decoration, but as the field on which victory is decided. In 1947, he marries Alison Peggy Worsted, a partnership that will matter more than outsiders realize. Peggy is intelligent, socially adept, and steady, qualities that complement Kerr's intensity. Their marriage becomes part of his ascent into circles where personal presentation is inseparable from professional opportunity. In Australia's mid-century establishment, the private and public selves are braided together. Kerr learns to navigate that braid. By the 1950s and 1960s, he is no longer merely a talented barrister. He is a figure in the legal and civic landscape. He becomes active in the Australian Labor Party in New South Wales, an affiliation that surprises some who later try to paint him as a simple conservative instrument. Kerr's labor connections are real and they matter. He moves among unionists, reformers, and party organizers. He is not a street corner firebrand. He is a legal mind in a political world, A man who believes that the machinery of government can be tuned and improved. But politics is never just ideals. It is factions, grudges, loyalties, and the slow accumulation of enemies you don't notice until they are already in position. Kerr's temperament, confident, sometimes prickly, convinced of his own judgment, wins him admirers and irritates rivals. He is the kind of man who can walk into a room and assume he belongs there, even if he once didn't. That assumption is a weapon. It is also a risk. He takes on prominent roles beyond party politics, including work connected to civil liberties and legal aid. He becomes associated with the Law Society and other institutions that sit at the intersection of law and public life. These are the years when he learns in detail how governments actually function, how decisions are drafted, how authority is delegated, and how responsibility can be blurred until no one is accountable. He sees the strengths of the system and its loopholes. And then comes a turning point that feels at first like a reward for decades of effort. Judicial appointment. Kerr is appointed to the Commonwealth Industrial Court and later becomes chief judge of that court. It is a position of status and influence, placing him in the thick of disputes that can shake the economy, industrial relations, unions, employers, the tensions that run through Australia's working life. For a man who grew up in a labor suburb, it is a strange symmetry. He is now judging conflicts that echo the world his father lived in. The court is not glamorous, but it is powerful. Industrial disputes can paralyze industries, and the legal rulings around them can inflame politics. Kerr's decisions and his style draw attention. He is seen as capable, forceful, and sometimes controversial. He is not a judge who fades into the background. He is a judge who leaves fingerprints. At the same time, he is moving through elite networks, legal, political, and social, that will later become crucial. He is appointed to the Supreme Court of New South Wales. The boy from Balmain is now sitting among the highest judicial ranks in the state. The distance traveled is enormous, and it changes him. He becomes Sir John Kerr, knighted, decorated, increasingly comfortable in the rituals of authority. Yet the old hunger remains. He does not merely want to be respected. He wants to matter. And here the real conflict begins to form, not yet visible to the public, but tightening like a wire. Kerr's life is becoming a collision point between two forces, the democratic world of elected politics and the constitutional world of viceregal power, ancient, inherited, and often misunderstood. He is a man who believes in the system, but also believes he can interpret it better than others. That belief will one day put him on a clock, because in Australia's constitutional monarchy, there exists a role that is both ceremonial and lethal, the Governor-General. Most of the time, it is a figurehead, a ribbon cutter, a dignified presence, but hidden inside the office are reserve powers, the ability, in extreme circumstances, to act without or against ministerial advice. They are rarely used. They are debated in law journals and whispered about in political crises. They are the kind of power that sits like a loaded weapon in a drawer, ignored until someone reaches for it. Kerr, with his legal mind and his taste for institutional authority, is exactly the kind of person who would take that drawer seriously. By the early 1970s, Australia is changing fast. The old post-war consensus is cracking. Protest movements rise. The Vietnam War divides the country. The Labour Party, after long years in opposition federally, is surging under Gough Whitlam, bold, impatient, determined to remake Australia. The establishment is nervous. The opposition is ruthless. The Senate, with its power to block supply, becomes a battlefield. The Constitution, usually quiet, begins to hum with tension. And in the middle of this, Kerr's name starts to circulate for higher office. Not elected office, but something stranger, the Crown-S representative. It is not a job you campaign for. It is a job you are chosen for, often through a web of recommendations, reputations, and private assurances. Kerr's labor connections make him palatable to Whitlam's government. His judicial stature makes him palatable to conservatives and to the palace. He looks on paper like a bridge between worlds. But bridges are where collapses happen. In 1974, the possibility becomes real. Kerr is approached, considered, weighed. The conversations are discreet, the stakes enormous. If he becomes Governor-General, he will be expected to be above politics. Yet his entire life has been built inside politics, law, and ambition. He will be expected to be neutral. Yet neutrality is not a personality trait. It is a discipline. And discipline is hardest when you believe you are right. The offer comes, the appointment is made. John Kerr is to become the 18th Governor-General of Australia. For the public, it will look like a dignified culmination, a working-class boy rising to the nation's highest constitutional office. For Kerr, it is something else as well, the ultimate validation, the ultimate stage. And for Australia, though almost no one understands it yet, it is the moment the countdown begins. Because once Kerr steps into Government House, he will inherit not just ceremonies and speeches, but a set of powers that can end a government. And sooner than anyone expects, he will face a choice with a deadline attached. Act or be acted upon. Decide or be forced. Remain, a symbol, or become the story. And the most terrifying part is this. The crisis that will define him is already forming, like a storm beyond the horizon. He just can't see the lightning yet. The day John Kerr walks into Government House, the building doesn't feel like a home. It feels like a vault. Polished floors, thick curtains, portraits of dead authority staring down like silent judges, and somewhere inside the constitutional paperwork of the Commonwealth, a power so sharp it's almost obscene, the ability to sack an elected prime minister. Most governor-generals spend their term cutting ribbons and smiling for cameras. Kerr is about to discover that the office can also be a trapdoor. He is sworn in as Governor-General on 11 July 1974. The appointment is, on the surface, a masterstroke of balance. Gough Whitlam's Labor government can point to Kerr's labor connections and working-class origins. Conservatives can point to his judicial rank, his knighthood, his comfort with establishment ritual. Kerr himself can tell a story that sounds like destiny. The boy from Balmain, the scholarship kid, the barrister, the judge, now the Crown's representative. But the job comes with a paradox that will start eating at him immediately. He must be above politics while standing at the exact point where politics and the Constitution collide. At first, the public sees the expected pageantry. Kerr hosts receptions, travels, gives speeches about unity and service. He wears the uniform, performs the role, learns the choreography of vice-regal life. Yet behind the scenes, he is not a man who can simply float. He reads, he asks questions. He probes the edges of his authority. He is fascinated, almost magnetized by the reserve powers, those rarely used constitutional weapons that exist precisely for moments when the normal rules break down. In quiet conversations, in private notes, in the careful language of lawyers, Kerr begins to map the unthinkable, and the unthinkable is already moving toward him. Whitlam's government is not a gentle reform project. It is a storm front. In less than 3 years in office, Whitlam has pushed through sweeping changes: healthcare, education, urban policy, foreign affairs, moving with a speed that thrills supporters and terrifies opponents. The old order feels itself slipping. The Liberal Country Party opposition, led by Malcolm Fraser, is not merely disagreeing, it is hunting for leverage. And the Senate, where the government does not have secure control, becomes the choke point. Then the government is hit by scandal and chaos that gives its enemies oxygen. The loans affair erupts. Ministers seeking unconventional overseas loans to fund ambitious programs, a tangle of intermediaries, and questionable judgment that makes the government look reckless. Whitlam insists his government still commands the confidence of the House of Representatives, the chamber that, in democratic instinct, should decide who governs. But Fraser and the opposition see a different battlefield: supply. In Australia, the government needs Parliament to pass appropriation bills, money to pay public servants, run departments, keep the state alive. Convention says the Senate should not block supply, but convention is not law, and Fraser is willing to do what others hesitate to do: use the Senate to starve the government into submission. Kerr watches this with a judge's mind and a politician's memory. He knows conventions are only as strong as the willingness to obey them. He also knows something else, something colder. If supply is blocked long enough, the country doesn't just face a political argument. It faces a shutdown, salaries unpaid, services disrupted, a government that cannot govern in the most literal sense because it cannot spend. And now Kerr's office stops being ceremonial. It becomes a pressure chamber. Whitlam and Kerr meet regularly. The prime minister is brilliant, forceful, sometimes dismissive of caution. Kerr is formal, intense, increasingly anxious about the constitutional endgame. Whitlam's position is clear. If the Senate blocks supply, he will call a half-Senate election or find another political path. But he will not resign, and he will not be bullied by an opposition using what he sees as an illegitimate tactic. Fraser's position is equally clear. No supply until Whitlam goes to an election. Two men are pulling on the same rope, and the rope is tied around the nation's finances. Kerr is caught between them, but he is not neutral in temperament. He is a man who believes in order, in procedure, in the idea that the system must have a circuit breaker. He begins to consult quietly, carefully, with legal authorities. He seeks advice from the Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Garfield Barwick, a towering legal figure with his own political history. Kerr wants to know in black and white terms what he can do if the crisis escalates. Barwick's advice will later become infamous. It supports the view that the Governor-General has the power to dismiss a prime minister who cannot secure supply and to appoint someone else who can. That advice is like handing a man a loaded pistol and telling him it is legal to use it. But Kerr's deeper fear is not only what he can do, it is what might be done to him. Because the Governor-General serves at the pleasure of the monarch, on the advice of the Prime Minister. If Whitlam suspects Kerr is considering dismissal, Whitlam could advise the Queen to terminate Kerr's commission. In other words, the moment Kerr warns Whitlam, Kerr risks being removed before he can act. This is where the clock starts ticking in Kerr's mind. It is not a public countdown with headlines and speeches. It is a private, tightening deadline. If he believes dismissal may be necessary, he may have to do it without warning, or lose the ability to do it at all. That logic, constitutional, ruthless, and psychologically corrosive, pushes Kerr into secrecy. Through 1975, the atmosphere thickens. The Senate numbers shift in controversial ways after the deaths and resignations of senators, and the replacement process becomes a political brawl. The opposition senses opportunity. The government senses sabotage. The public senses that something is wrong, even if the mechanics are hard to explain. It is the kind of crisis that makes ordinary people feel powerless. A fight in Canberra that could decide whether their pay arrives, whether hospitals function, whether the country keeps moving. By October 1975, Fraser commits to the blockade. The Senate defers the supply bills. The government's money is now on a fuse. Whitlam refuses to yield. He believes Fraser will be punished by voters for such a tactic. He believes the Governor-General will follow convention and accept the Prime Minister's advice. He believes above all that democratic legitimacy will win. Kerr is no longer simply observing. He is calculating dates. Inside Government House, the conversations become sharper. Kerr asks Whitlam what he will do if supply does not pass. Whitlam outlines options: an election for half the Senate, political pressure, public campaigning. Kerr hears uncertainty where Whitlam hears resolve. Kerr begins to imagine the moment when the government cannot pay its bills. He imagines the Governor-General blamed for inaction, for letting the machinery seize. He imagines the Crown's representative presiding over paralysis. And he imagines, too, the other nightmare: acting and being remembered as the man who overthrew a government. The tension is not abstract. It is physical. It is the weight of a decision that cannot be undone. Kerr's relationship with Whitlam becomes a dance of guarded words. Whitlam speaks as if Kerr is a constitutional referee who will blow the whistle only when asked. Kerr begins to see himself as the man who must decide whether the game itself can continue. He does not tell Whitlam that he has sought Barwick's advice. He does not tell Whitlam that he is considering dismissal. He does not tell Whitlam that he fears being dismissed first. Each silence is a step deeper into a tunnel where the exit narrows behind him. And then the deadline becomes real. By early November, the government is running out of time. The Treasury's ability to function without supply is limited. Public servants pay, government obligations. Everything is approaching a point where improvisation becomes impossible. Kerr's mind locks onto the idea that he must ensure a government is in place that can secure supply immediately. That means in practice one thing: if Whitlam will not resign or call an election, Kerr may have to remove him. But Kerr also knows the act would be explosive. It would not be a quiet administrative adjustment. It would be a constitutional detonation. It would split the country, perhaps for generations. It would turn the Governor-General from a symbol into a combatant. And it would turn John Kerr into a name spoken with fury. So he prepares like a man preparing for a surgical strike. He considers the mechanics. If he dismisses Whitlam, he must appoint someone else as Prime Minister. Someone who can guarantee supply. And then advise an election. The obvious candidate is Malcolm Fraser, the opposition leader. Fraser, for his part, is ready. He has the numbers in the Senate to pass supply if he is in office. The plan is brutally simple: remove Whitlam, install Fraser, pass supply, call an election. The simplicity is what makes it terrifying. It reduces a nation's democratic drama to a sequence of constitutional moves. Kerr's secrecy deepens. He keeps his counsel tight. He does not warn Whitlam because warning could trigger Whitlam to advise the Queen to sack him. Kerr convinces himself that surprise is not betrayal, but necessity. Yet every hour he delays, the risk grows. The risk of financial collapse, the risk of political violence, the risk of being outmaneuvered. And all the while, the public sees only the surface. Speeches, ceremonies, the calm face of the Governor General. They do not see the man in the vice-regal residence staring at the Constitution like it is a bomb manual, trying to decide which wire to cut. On 11 November 1975, Remembrance Day, a date already heavy with national memory, Whitlam arrives at Government House for what he believes is another meeting in a worsening dispute. He intends to advise Kerr to call a half-Senate election. He believes he is still the Prime Minister, still in control of the Democratic narrative. Kerr has decided that the time has run out. In a moment that will be replayed in Australian history like a gunshot echoing down a corridor, Kerr dismisses Whitlam as Prime Minister. The elected leader of the country is removed not by Parliament, not by voters, but by the Crown's representative using reserve powers that most Australians barely understood existed. Whitlam is stunned, then incandescent. He leaves Government House no longer Prime Minister, and the crisis instantly becomes something larger than politics. It becomes a national trauma. Kerr appoints Malcolm Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister on the condition that Fraser secures supply and advise a double dissolution election. Fraser moves quickly. The Senate passes the supply bills. The machinery of government is fed again. The constitutional sequence works, coldly, efficiently. But outside the parliamentary arithmetic, the country erupts. Crowds gather. Anger surges. The word coup is shouted. Kerr's name becomes a curse in some mouths and a defense of the Constitution in others. Whitlam, standing on the steps of Parliament House, delivers the line that will burn into the national memory. Well, may we say, God, save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General. It is theater, yes, but it is also a warning. Kerr has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. And now the man who once feared being trapped by circumstance is trapped by his own decision. Because the dismissal solves the immediate supply crisis, but it creates a larger one. Legitimacy? Who truly holds power in Australia? The elected parliament or the Crown's representative? Are reserve powers a safeguard or a weapon? Did Kerr save the system or break it? The questions are not academic anymore. They are shouted in streets, argued at dinner tables, printed in headlines, carried like stones in people's pockets. Kerr has acted under a time limit, money running out, government grinding toward paralysis, and he has chosen the most extreme constitutional remedy. He has done it without warning the Prime Minister, because he believed warning would neutralize his ability to act. That single strategic choice, secrecy, will become one of the most damning elements of his legacy. To his defenders, it is proof of necessity. To his critics, it is proof of betrayal. The election is set. The country will vote. Fraser will win decisively in December 1975, and supporters of the dismissal will point to that result as vindication. But elections do not erase the shock of the act itself. They do not rewind the moment an unelected official dismissed an elected government. They do not unmake the image of Whitlam walking out of Government House. The image of Kerr inside, signing papers that change the nation. And for Kerr personally, the cost begins immediately. He remains Governor General, but the office around him is no longer a neutral stage. It is a fortress under siege. Protesters appear wherever he goes. His movements require security. His public presence becomes a provocation. The vice-regal uniform, once a symbol of continuity, now looks to many like a costume worn by a man who has taken sides. Kerr, who craved legitimacy, now finds himself drowning in controversy so thick it stains everything he touches. The boy from Balmain has reached the summit of constitutional power, only to discover that at the top, there is no applause that can drown out the roar below. The weeks after 11 November don't feel like victory inside Government House. They feel like living inside a siren. Kerr wakes up to the sound of Australia arguing with itself. Not in Parliament, not in editorials, out in the open air. Crowds gather at gates and on streets. Placards rise like a second fence. People chant his name the way you chant at a villain in a theater. Except this isn't theater, and the hatred has weight. The Governor General's car becomes a moving target for shouting, for spitting, for fists thumping the metal as it passes. The uniform that once signaled continuity now looks to many like a costume worn by a man who has stolen something. And Kerr can't simply disappear. The office demands appearances, speeches, ceremonies. The choreography of the Crown's representative. Except now every ribbon cutting is a potential riot, every public step a spark. Security tightens, routes are changed, doors are watched. The vice-regal residence, meant to be a dignified symbol, starts to resemble a defended position. He has solved the immediate crisis of supply, but he has detonated a deeper one: trust. The country is no longer asking, who will pay the bills next week? It is asking, who really rules? And that question follows Kerr like a shadow that won't detach. In Canberra, the caretaker government moves with ruthless speed. Malcolm Fraser, installed on Kerr's commission, does exactly what he promised. He secures supply, then advises a double dissolution election. The machinery of government keeps running. Salaries are paid. Departments keep their lights on. On paper, the system has worked. But paper is not the same as legitimacy. Kerr watches the political temperature rise and realizes something chilling. The dismissal is not a single act. It is an ongoing event. It keeps happening every day in people's minds, every time they replay the moment and ask whether it was necessary or unforgivable. He can't undo it. He can only endure it. And then comes the election, December 1975, Australia's chance to deliver a verdict. Fraser wins decisively. To Kerr's defenders, it is the final stamp. The people have spoken, therefore the dismissal was justified. To Kerr's critics, it proves something else: that the shock of the dismissal, the sudden collapse of Whitlam's authority, the chaos, and fear and momentum helped create the very outcome now being used as vindication. The argument becomes circular, endless, and it never lands in a place where Kerr can breathe. He remains Governor General, but now he is a Governor General with a countdown running in his head. Because the office is not designed to be lived in under siege, the job depends on a kind of public consent. Quiet, unspoken, almost invisible. Once that consent is gone, the role becomes unbearable. Kerr begins to understand that the Constitution may have given him power, but it did not give him a way to be loved after using it. The pressure is not only outside, it is inside his own circle, inside his own mind. He is a man who has always needed to be taken seriously, by judges, by politicians, by institutions. Now he is taken seriously in the worst way, as a warning, as a symbol, as a wound. And there is another more private enemy tightening its grip: his health. Kerr's body is not a neutral vessel through this storm. He has long struggled with physical strain, and the stress of the crisis and its aftermath doesn't just exhaust him, it accelerates everything. The late nights, the constant vigilance, the sense that every decision is being weighed by history, it all lands on a nervous system that can't rest. He is aging in public, under floodlights, while half the country watches with anger, and the other half watches with expectation that he will never admit doubt. He tries to perform normality. He continues the formal duties. He hosts, he travels. He speaks about unity, about institutions, about Australia's stability. But the words sound different now, even to him. They sound like a man trying to convince a room that the building isn't on fire while smoke curls under the door. And then comes one of the strangest twists of all. The more Kerr is attacked, the more he clings to the idea that he must have been right. It is a psychological trap as old as human pride. If he admits error, he becomes not merely controversial, but catastrophic. If he admits he misjudged, then he didn't just make a hard call, he broke the country's faith for nothing. So he hardens. He insists in private and sometimes in public that he acted to protect constitutional government. He leans on the legal logic, on the advice he sought, on the argument that a government unable to secure supply cannot govern. He repeats the reasoning like a prayer. But the prayer doesn't silence the crowd. Every time he appears, the protests return. People shout shame and resign. The Governor General, supposed to be above politics, has become the most political figure in the nation. It is a grotesque inversion of the role. And Kerr, who once feared being dismissed by Whitlam, now faces a different kind of removal: the slow stripping away of dignity by public contempt. He begins to limit his movements. He becomes more guarded. The residence becomes smaller, not physically but psychologically, as if the walls are closing in. The office that once looked like a vault now feels like a cage. Inside that cage, Kerr's relationships fray. The dismissal has not only split the country, it has split friendships, professional networks, the quiet assumptions of Canberra society. Some people who once smiled now avoid his gaze. Others remain loyal, but loyalty itself becomes suspect. Are they loyal to him or to what he represents? Even support can feel like another kind of pressure, another demand that he never show weakness. and weakness is exactly what time is bringing. By 1977, Kerr is approaching the end of his term, and the question is no longer whether he can continue, but whether he should. The controversy has not faded, it has fossilized. It has become part of Australia's political geology. Every new debate about the Constitution, every argument about the monarchy, every discussion of democratic legitimacy drags his name back into the light like a body being exhumed. He knows that if he stays, he risks further damaging the office itself. If the Governor-General becomes permanently associated with partisan rage, then the institution loses its stabilizing function. Kerr, who acted in the name of stability, now sees that his presence may be destabilizing by itself. And so the end begins to form, not as a dramatic resignation on a single day, but as a gradual acceptance that the role has become unlivable. In 1977, he leaves office. Officially, it is the natural conclusion of a term. In reality, it feels like an extraction. Like a man being pulled out of a burning building, not because the fire's out, but because his lungs can't take any more smoke. Yet leaving the office does not mean leaving the story. Kerr steps out of Government House and discovers that the controversy is portable. It follows him into private life. It follows him into restaurants, into public spaces, into the way strangers look at him. The title Sir does not protect him. Sometimes it inflames the anger. The knighthood, the formal honors, the establishment symbols, these are now part of the indictment in the minds of those who see the dismissal as an elite act against an elected government. He tries to reclaim a normal existence, but normality has been confiscated by history. And then, in a move that seems almost designed to pour fuel on embers, he accepts further honors, most notably becoming a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. To supporters, it is recognition of service. To critics, it is proof that the establishment rewards its own, that the dismissal was not merely constitutional but class-bound, imperial, a relic of a system that can override voters. The honor becomes another headline, another argument, another reason for the anger to stay alive. Kerr's defenders continue to frame him as a man who did what had to be done. They point to the constitutional mechanics, to the Senate's blockade, to the need for supply, to the election result. They argue that he prevented a governmental breakdown, that he acted as a circuit breaker when politics became dangerous. His critics never let go of the secrecy. The fact that he did not warn Whitlam, the fact that he sought advice from Barwick without telling the Prime Minister, the fact that he feared being dismissed and therefore chose surprise. To them, that is not prudence, it is ambush. And ambush, in a democracy, feels like betrayal even when it is legal. Kerr lives inside that split interpretation, like a man living between two mirrors, each reflecting a different version of him. And the most brutal part is this: he cannot control which version survives in the public imagination. He can write, he can speak, he can explain, but explanations do not erase images. The image that remains is simple and violent. An elected prime minister walking into Government House and walking out dismissed. A signature on paper that changed the nation. A crowd roaring, "Nothing will save the Governor-General." A man in vice-regal authority becoming, overnight, the most contested figure in Australia. Time does not soften it, time sharpens it into myth. Kerr's later years are marked by declining health and the long echo of 1975. The stress, the public hostility, the sense of being permanently on trial, none of it is a good companion to aging. He becomes more withdrawn. The world he once navigated with confidence, courtrooms, committees, formal rooms full of power, has been replaced by a narrower existence, where his name is a trigger. And yet, even in that narrowing, the story refuses to end neatly. Because the dismissal does not remain a single historical episode, it becomes a living argument about Australia's identity. It feeds Republican sentiment. It fuels debates about whether the Governor-General's powers should be codified, limited, clarified. It becomes a case study in how conventions can collapse when ambition meets opportunity. It becomes a warning about what happens when the written rules leave space for the unthinkable. In that sense, Kerr's work as Governor-General continues long after he leaves the building, because the country keeps wrestling with the consequences. He dies on 24th of March 1991, one day short of his 77th birthday. Even death does not grant him silence. Obituaries reopen the case. Commentators relitigate the decision. Old footage is replayed. Old speeches are quoted. The same question returns as if Australia cannot stop touching the bruise. Did he save the Constitution, or did he wound democracy? And perhaps the most haunting twist is that Kerr, the scholarship boy from Balmain who climbed into the highest ceremonial office in the land ends up as something far larger and far lonelier than he ever intended. A symbol of the moment Australia discovered that its system contains a hidden blade, a blade that can be drawn in a crisis, a blade that, once drawn, changes the person holding it forever. If you want a clean ending, John Kerr never gives you one. Because the day he leaves Government House, he doesn't step out of the story. He steps into a smaller, harsher arena where there are no uniforms to hide behind, no constitutional phrases to recite like armor, no staff to buffer the world, just a man in the echo of one decision, following him like a second shadow. He tries at first to live as if the storm will eventually move on. He takes up appointments, accepts invitations, keeps the posture of a former governor general, but the country has learned his face too well. In public, he is recognized not as a retired jurist or a former vice-regal figure, but as a walking flashpoint. A dinner out can turn into a scene. A quiet entrance becomes a gauntlet. People stare as if they're looking at a photograph that should be in a textbook, not standing beside them in a lobby. And then comes the detail that feels almost cinematic in its cruelty: the honors. Kerr accepts high imperial honors after the dismissal, most famously the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. In another life, it would have been a capstone. In this life, it lands like a match on dry grass. To his supporters, it is the crown acknowledging service. To his critics, it is the establishment congratulating itself for humiliating an elected government. The letters after his name don't elevate him. They harden the caricature. Sir John Kerr becomes, for many, not a person, but a verdict. And Kerr can't stop himself from trying to correct the verdict. He begins to write, to speak, to explain. He returns again and again to the same architecture of justification: the Senate's refusal of supply, the paralysis of government, the duty of the Governor General to ensure a ministry can govern, the necessity of acting before Whitlam could advise his dismissal. He leans on legality, on precedent, on the logic that a system must have a circuit breaker when politics becomes a deadlock. But the country isn't arguing only about legality. It's arguing about trust, and trust is where Kerr bleeds. Because the most radioactive element of 1975 is not the signature on the dismissal papers. It's the secrecy, the private consultations, the decision not to warn Whitlam, the fear, real and documented, that Whitlam might remove him first. The sense that Kerr, the man meant to embody neutral continuity, had begun to think like a player in the game. Even if he believed he was protecting the Constitution, the method looked like an ambush. And in a democracy, ambush is a word that sticks. So Kerr's post office life becomes a strange kind of trial without a judge. Every interview is cross-examination. Every public appearance is evidence. Every attempt to defend himself is treated by some as further proof that he knows he did something unforgivable. And while the country debates, his body starts to fail him. The stress of the dismissal years doesn't evaporate when he hands over the office. It stays in the bloodstream. His health declines through the 1980s. He becomes more withdrawn, more cautious, more brittle. The man who once moved through courtrooms and committees with the confidence of someone climbing toward the center of power now lives with the posture of someone bracing for impact. There is a ticking clock now, and it isn't political. It's physical, and it changes the tone of everything. Because when time is short, you don't just want to be right, you want to be understood. Kerr wants, desperately, to be seen as a man who acted out of duty, not malice, out of constitutional responsibility, not personal ambition. He wants the story to include the scholarship boy from Balmain, the orphan child who fought his way into law, the jurist who believed in institutions because institutions had once been his ladder out of poverty. But history is not obligated to be fair. History is obligated only to be remembered. And Kerr's memory is welded to one date. The dismissal becomes bigger than the man. It becomes a permanent argument about what Australia is. It feeds Republican sentiment with a single, unforgettable image: an unelected representative of the Crown removing an elected prime minister. It becomes the example people reach for whenever they talk about reserve powers, as if they're a loaded weapon kept in a drawer. Legal, irreal, and terrifying precisely because you don't see it until it's in your face. In universities, it becomes a case study. In pubs, it becomes a fight. In Parliament, it becomes a ghost that walks behind new crises. Every time a government and a Senate collide, every time supply is threatened, every time someone says Constitutional Convention, Kerr's name rises again like a flare. And the twist, the one Kerr could never have predicted when he was a young lawyer dreaming of respectability, is that his act, meant to stabilize the system, helps destabilize the nation's faith in it. Because after 1975, Australians know something they can't unknow. The rules contain a hidden blade. It can be drawn, it can cut, and the person holding it can insist, forever, that the cut was necessary. Kerr watches this from the sidelines, increasingly frail, increasingly boxed in by the story. He is not the protagonist anymore. He is the symbol, and symbols don't get to sleep. Symbols don't get to have ordinary days. Symbols don't get to be forgiven quietly. They are carried around by strangers who never met the person inside them. Even his death can't close the file. On 24th of March 1991, Kerr dies in Sydney, one day short of his 77th birthday. The timing feels like a final, indifferent joke from the calendar. The man who lived by deadlines, by constitutional clocks, by the pressure of a crisis that demanded action, before it's too late, runs out of time himself with the finish line in sight, and immediately the country does what it always does with him. It reopens the case. Obituaries don't simply mourn, they argue. Commentators don't simply remember, they prosecute or defend. The footage returns. Whitlam walking in, Whitlam walking out, the stunned faces, the words that became a national scar. The same question is asked again, as if repetition might finally produce an answer everyone can live with. Did Kerr save the Constitution? Or did he wound democracy? But there's another question underneath it, quieter and more unsettling. What does it do to a person to become the hinge of a nation's anger? Kerr's life, taken as a whole, is a climb, out of hardship, into law, into influence, into the highest ceremonial office in the land. It is the story of a boy who believed that if you mastered the rules would protect you. And then, at the peak, he discovers the cruelest paradox of power. Sometimes the rules give you the right to do something that will destroy you. Because the dismissal doesn't just change Australia, it changes Kerr's entire meaning. Before 1975, he is a jurist, an administrator, a man of committees and courts. After 1975, he is a single moment in human form. A cautionary tale, a rallying cry, a villain, a defender of order, a traitor, a constitutional guardian, a man who panicked, a man who acted bravely, a man who acted secretly, a man who couldn't see any other way. All of those versions exist at once, and none of them can be fully erased. And that is his final imprisonment. Not in a building, not behind gates, not under protest signs, but inside the permanent argument of a country that still hasn't decided what it wants its democracy to be. So when you picture John Kerr at the end, don't picture the grand rooms of Government House. Picture something smaller, sharper, an aging man carrying a decision that cannot be put down, listening to a nation that will not. Stop talking and realizing, too late, that the highest office he ever reached was also the narrowest ledge he ever stood on. He drew the hidden blade. Australia saw it. And neither the country nor the man who held it was ever the same again.